latest weather, traffic, and news updates online at 560theanswer.com.
This hourly segment is brought to you by Forever Remodeling. Stress-free and high-quality remodeling. View their stunning transformations online at the number 4everremodeling.com.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in Turkey for this supposed sit-down between the Russians and the Ukrainians over forging a ceasefire and ultimately a lasting peace. Rubio saying this about how the invasion by Russia and the war between Russia and Ukraine will ultimately be settled.
We'll see what happens over the next couple of days in that regard, but we want to see progress made in that regard, and whatever mechanism is outlined, whatever the process is that needs to happen, I mean, we are open to being constructive and helpful in any way we can to end the conflict. I will say this, and I'll repeat it, that there is no military solution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This war is going to end not through a military solution, but through a diplomatic one.
But how much progress can be made if Putin won't deign to appear? Trump not surprised by Putin's absence, as he said in response to a question about this in Doha.
I didn't anticipate. I actually said, why would he go if I'm not going? Because I wasn't going to go. I wasn't planning to go. I would go. But I wasn't planning to go, and I said, I don't think he's going to go if I don't go, and that turned out to be right. But we have people there. Marco, as you know, is doing a fantastic job. Marco's there, Secretary of State, and we have people there. But I didn't think it was possible for Putin to go if I'm not there.
George Beebe is a former director of Russia analysis at the CIA, former staff advisor to Vice President Cheney on Russia and on intelligence matters. Currently director of grand strategy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. George Beebe, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation.
So what sort of expectations should we have about today's confab?
Well, I think both sides have gotten the message that they need to be talking, that there has to be a diplomatic process. And what they're fighting over right now is what they're going to talk about. The Ukrainians want to talk about a ceasefire and only a ceasefire because they're under great pressure on the battlefield. They're losing the war. They don't have enough men. They don't have enough equipment, and they can't get enough men and equipment. They don't have enough of them themselves, and the West can't supply it. So they need a breathing spell. They need a ceasefire that can allow them to rest and regroup and defend themselves more effectively. Well, that's not what Russia wants to talk about, obviously. Russia doesn't want to give up its advantage on the battlefield. It wants to use that leverage to talk about what a political settlement ought to look like. And it wants to talk about what the framework for that settlement is all about. So that's what you're seeing playing out in Istanbul right now. The Russians want to talk seriously about the framework of a political settlement. The Ukrainians only want to talk about a ceasefire. And that's something that probably won't be resolved unless the United States weighs in and essentially says to the Ukrainians, look, you're going to have to talk about more than just a ceasefire because that's not going to cut it.
And Putin's absence, there's sort of a snub, that doesn't exactly scream constructive engagement.
Well, what the Russians are doing is approaching this like a normal diplomatic negotiation. Presidents don't usually start out a negotiation by getting together and hashing out a lot of the arcane details of a settlement. They come in toward the end of a process to resolve the most difficult issues that can't be resolved at lower levels. That's what's typical, and I think that's how the Russians are approaching this.
Yeah.
They send a team that is prepared to negotiate the framework, and then Putin is ready to step in at the appropriate time.
Well, but I mean, it runs counter to Trump's sense of urgency about this, to stop the killing, to get something done before we lose interest, more or less. And, it just doesn't speak to, it's not an encouraging sign, I guess, at least to me, that Trump can't even impose sort of a sense of urgency on Putin in terms of making a deal, much less terms of the deal that could be acceptable to the Ukrainians?
Well, I think the Russians have said, look, we've got a framework that we began to negotiate in Istanbul in 2022 after the invasion. The Ukrainian and Russian negotiators made a fair amount of progress. There were still some issues on which they had wide differences, but the Russians have said, hey, you broke off talks at that time. Let's resume them. Let's talk about the things that were in play then. And that's why Putin proposed getting together in Istanbul, where they had been talking 3 years ago. He wants to pick up where they left off on that. Now, that's not something the Ukrainians want to do. They simply wanted to tell the Russians, hey, stop fighting, which would make no sense for the Russians to agree to. They would be giving up the leverage. It would be sort of like Trump in dealing with China saying, yeah, we'll just drop the tariffs, and then we'll hope that we can get together and reach a broader agreement on trade terms. We're not going to give up the leverage that we have unless we've got a deal that we like, and that's how the Russians are approaching this settlement with Ukraine.
Are they still, do you believe, proposing or will propose today the same things they were proposing 3 years ago in Istanbul, things like Ukraine can't take foreign military aid, Ukraine's military has to be downsized, those sorts of things, in addition to territorial gains?
Well, that's certainly where they're going to start out. I think the key issue for the Russians is to make sure that Ukraine is not in NATO and NATO forces are not in Ukraine. Now, in return, they've indicated a willingness to support Ukrainian membership in the European Union. Now, if those terms are things that we can actually get agreed on paper, I think that would be a significant achievement for the Ukrainians. It would be a concession from Russia that Ukraine will not be militarily in the West, but it will be militarily, will be politically and economically anchored in the West. And that's a huge concession for the Russians to make. Now, the point about how large the Ukrainian military is going to be, that's going to be a very contentious issue. And that's one where the Ukrainians need American help. They don't have much leverage over that issue because they're losing the war. But the United States does have a fair amount of leverage over Russia because Russia is concerned about American weapons in Europe itself, not but on NATO territory. The Russians can't do anything about our force posture there. And depending on how tough we want to be, we could put a lot of pressure on the Russians to concede that Ukraine needs a legitimate self-defense capability. They need a capable military. So that is going to be a contentious issue. The Russians are going to start out with a maximalist demand, and the United States is going to have to lean on them pretty heavily to come up with something that's acceptable.
Well, let's talk about troop levels in both places. Is Russia still using North Korean troops?
I don't believe they are. The North Korean troops that they had been using were primarily in Kursk, in that region of Russia that Ukraine had invaded a little over a year ago. But they didn't actually use North Korean troops on Ukrainian territory, to my knowledge. And at least according to press reports, the Russians aren't any longer employing North Korean troops on Russian territory.
And then what's the average age of the Ukrainian soldier? Because they keep having to recruit new people.
Well, it's hard to say right now. Nobody has published data on that for over a year. The last we heard, it was somewhere in the mid-40s, which is an alarming figure. And my guess is that that number has gotten even worse since then. The Ukrainians have a real difficult time right now, not just bringing people into the military, but more important, training them and building them into coherent, capable military units that can do more than just stand in a trench. That's a real problem for them. And there's no easy solution short of the United States and other NATO countries actually putting our own forces on the ground in Ukraine, which would mean a direct war with Russia. And that's not something that we want to do. It's not something we should do, in my opinion.
Is there any possibility of, to use a tortured sports metaphor, like a 3 or 4 team deal involving the Chinese Communist Party, involving the mullahs in Tehran, all of which there are ongoing negotiations for various things, as you know. Is there any way of, using one as a pressure point on the other to get deals all the way around that are in America's best interests, or is that not feasible? It's just become too complicated, and we'd have to give up too much to enemies of of this country in order to get everybody on board to settle this?
Well, I think there are some subtle ways that we could bring those other countries into this situation in ways that can be helpful. What the Russians are trying to do right now is to signal to us that they can be helpful in striking a nuclear deal on Iran, containing that Iranian nuclear program. And I think the Russians' hope is that that will in turn incline the U.S. to be more flexible on Ukraine, but also see the benefits of an overall improvement in U.S.-Russian relations. Now, the Chinese are an interesting one. I think we have hoped that the Chinese would put pressure on the Russians to end the war, and the Chinese have really refused to do that. But the Chinese may be able to play a role in Ukraine's economic reconstruction after a peace settlement is agreed. Now, the virtue of that is that the Russians, I think, would think twice about trying to reinvade Ukraine if there were large numbers of Chinese construction workers on the ground that would be caught in the middle of the crossfire. So that might be something we could consider as a way of disincentivizing any Russian violations of the terms of the settlement.
Well, the other aspect of that is that mineral rights deal that we struck with the Ukrainians, too. So that would tend to lead one to believe that Putin knows that he is not going to end Ukraine as a sovereign country because I think because of, in part, the posture that Trump has taken and in part the deal that he's made to protect American interests. So it seems to me at least that forestalls that possibility as this process languishes on.
Yeah, that's right. That mineral deal sends a very strong signal to Russia that the United States is not simply going to concede Ukraine as a Russian sphere of influence. We're going to be involved there in a substantial way for many years to come, and the Russians are going to have to simply accept that. We're not going to be involved militarily. The Russians get that. We don't want to be involved there militarily. But we are going to be involved diplomatically and economically. We're going to have a presence. It's not going to be Russia's sphere of influence.
Do you have any sort of sense of how protracted this process will be to get to at least a cessation of hostilities, if not a formal deal?
No, I think with a month or two of negotiations that are serious, that the United States is supporting in a serious way, there could be enough accomplished that we could put a ceasefire in place. Now, you're not going to get a comprehensive settlement of all these issues that are in play anytime soon. They're very complicated. It's going to take many months, if not years, to resolve them fully. But you can make enough progress, I think, fairly soon that you could realistically anticipate a cessation of hostilities.
George Beebe is a former director of Russia analysis at the CIA, former staff advisor to Vice President Cheney on Russia and on intelligence matters. Currently, director of grand strategy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. George Beebe, thanks so much for your time and insights. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 64636 to download the app today. Gain insight into building strong marriages and raising godly children with focus